Listen, I want to make an observation here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're days away from opening the House of Assembly, and of course that requires the speech from the throne, and that paves the way for what your government or the government you're a minister of, the government plans as part of its legislative package and its suggestions and operations and plans for Nova Scotians, and just days away, you think you'd be holding the cards close to your chest and holding back, but not so. Day after day, announcement after announcement, some of them involving new spending and other things. It seems that if you've got a good idea, you're not holding it back, you're just announcing it. Brian Comer, the Minister for Mental Health, had a press conference today, and he's opening the purse strings and a new initiative as well. But you've done that all over the place. Isn't that a little bit outside the normal realm of politics?
Yeah, typically yes, but I don't think with what's going on worldwide and specifically with our neighbors, and I don't think it's a time for the Premier and our government to hold our cards to our chests. We've been very clear that we want to work for Nova Scotians, and you mentioned about our ideas getting out there. We've also been talking to stakeholders over the last couple of weeks with the threat of possible tariffs. Talking with stakeholders, what are your ideas? And there's been a lot of good ideas coming to the table, but a lot of good conversation going on in Nova Scotia. But no, it's a little bit different, but I think it's needed at the time.
Well, one of the announcements, of course, is opening up the door to nurses, setting them up to be able to write prescriptions. Normally they deliver the prescriptions, that is, they deliver the meds, but now to be able to write the prescriptions, that cuts out a couple of steps, because traditionally you get a doctor to write the script, you go to the pharmacy to get the meds, and you can keep it in-house. That's another move in the healthcare sector, certainly. You could have held that one back a week and then announced it from the ledge. But no, you wanted to get it out there, and that says something about your war on the problems in healthcare for sure.
No, absolutely, and that one wasn't really a surprise. It was talked about actually last year during the budget cycle and the process. We heard rumblings that this was an idea that came to the floor of the minister responsible. So these are ideas that are coming to us as government, that Nova Scotians are bringing to the table and sharing their ideas for possible fixes, if you will. But expanding scopes of practices, allowing people to work to their scope of practice. Imagine that 10 years ago when we had this discussion. But look, it's just to improve healthcare, the lives, economics of Nova Scotia.
Now, speaking of healthcare, and an offshoot from that, you have a separate minister now, the Minister for Mental Health Care, Mental Health and Addictions Care. That's Brian Comer. And he stepped forward at a press conference today to announce that your government is going to actually begin paying for mental health services, a service previously offered by psychologists and licensed practitioners, but usually paid for either out of pocket or through insurance companies. And now you're setting up a complete department to do that at a time when I think most thinking people would realize we have a problem in our culture, in our society. And, the deaths that we witnessed at the hands of intimate partner violence and other issues, homeless issues that keep pointing back to healthcare needs and on and on and on. This is a big, big step. Not only that, but a costly one, too.
It is. And if you recall when we were putting our platform together, 2 elections ago now, when we formed government, this was something that was discussed. And when Minister Comer came to be the Minister of Mental Health Care, this was something that he had talked about over the last 3 years. So I know he's very proud of today's announcement. And I mean, before politics, Minister Comer worked in the mental health care. He was a mental health nurse, and he saw the need for change, and that's why Minister Comer got into politics to entice some change. And I know he's celebrating this announcement today, and going to work hard with his department and our government to make sure that it comes to fruition and the availability straight across the province.
Now, you opened up this conversation. You mentioned, of course, about the crisis that the country faced, and we've broken that down by province, of course. And Nova Scotia faced a very serious concern with that man named Trump and his desire to put a 25% tariff on everything. Now, he's come up with a 30-day reprieve, you might say. Who's to say what he's going to do with it? It was a far-fetched, crazy, wild brainwave of his that should never have been seen the light of day, but that's who he is, I guess. But one thing that's come from that is the Prime Minister kind of opened up and sat down with the premiers and has been doing so on a weekly basis, trying to deal with that. And I see it as an opportunity now, too, to look at the barriers that we have installed within Canada, between the provinces, and fighting over jurisdictions, federal, provincial, and then fighting province by province. This is maybe was an unnecessary thing in the first place to have to deal with Trump on an issue like this, but I'm glad we did, because I'm hoping that more will come from this within Canada. What do you think?
Well, as you watch this unfold, obviously, this is not a position that anybody in Canada could even predict, let alone want to be in. And what I would say, your reference to the provincial borders and provincial trade back and forth, as I see things being discussed on the news, in the media, hearing our premier talk, we actually see the premiers sitting around that table, and all their heads are turned towards Atlantic Canada. And as you know, speaking with our premier, our Atlantic premiers get together regularly. And this is a topic they put on the table 3 years ago, interprovincial trade. This is a topic that they've been tackling within our provinces for a few years now. So we see all the premiers' heads turning towards our premiers here in the Maritimes and Atlantic Canada, saying, "What have you done already? How are you doing it?" And also you see when our premiers get together nationally, this has been a conversation for many years, but it puts it to the forefront. We can't put all of our eggs in one basket and expect the same return for centuries to come. We do need to diversify, and I would argue too, we don't just need to diversify within our provinces. We also need to look at other trading partners as well, and how can we expand those trade agreements? Because let's face it, we don't know what's going to happen over the course of the next 4 years, but we need to be prepared.
Well, you're absolutely right that the Atlantic provinces have been looking at cooperation for a long, long time, and the rest of Canada wasn't paying any attention whatsoever. And you're also right that they are paying attention now, because they begin to realize, to say that we can't have an Ontario plumber come and fix my pipes is ridiculous, because it should be a Canadian plumber. And it's interesting, the Conservative Party nationally, and Dr. Ellis in particular, is promoting the idea of what they call a Blue Seal campaign for doctors and nurses. And yet, the premier, our premier, was the first to talk about how if a doctor from somewhere outside the country or somewhere else in Canada is licensed and the in Canada, that's all that should matter. So the rest of the country is beginning to look at the same thing that we've already done.
Absolutely, and when you look at that, and speaking about our premier being the first to say that, if a doctor's good enough for the UK, it's good enough for Nova Scotia, so to speak. He was speaking about that when he was leader of opposition, and using the comparison of what you're just talking about. As an electrician, I can go anywhere in Canada and work and get my hours for trade. There was an agreement with a Western province. When they came back from the oil fields, they can come back and write their exams in Nova Scotia. And Premier Houston used that analogy when he was in opposition, and now we're making change. And quite frankly, Nova Scotia is leading the pack on a lot of things, but it's because of agreements within our Atlantic provinces, and agreements that we're competing for that same nurse coming out of that university, or the same doctor coming out of the university that same year. We're all competing and trying to draw those people away. But one of the agreements, I think you heard the Premier talk about a while ago, we were not going to try and go poach healthcare workers. We're not going to go try to poach trades from within our provinces and things. But we're talking about something much bigger as well, Bill, and that's the ability for our business in Nova Scotia to be able to do trade with the neighboring province, with a neighboring country, and trade partners that we have all over the world. It's a huge conversation, and quite frankly, we have the expertise in our province to help guide our government and give ideas and move forward.
Now, I'm gonna open a can of worms here, maybe, but these issues, these problems of interprovincial barriers, they're brought about by the provinces themselves. And over the years, governments, and maybe not yours yet, but in recent years, but governments generally would put a barricade at a company bidding on public contracts and say, we want to make sure only our companies can bid. So you put a barricade up. And so that's been true over the years. And those barricades were put up on behalf of not so much the province, but in protecting the interests of businesses. It seems that governments will always respond when business says, I need your help. But what about us? What about the individual taxpayer who says, they've got it in Toronto, why can't we have it too? And that's a question that never gets answered. What do you think?
Yeah, no, and these are barriers that need brought down too. And you're talking about a piece of legislation that passed the last session, the fall session of the legislature, where a Nova Scotia company can get first option within a percentage, but then it's expanded out to the other provinces. New Brunswick does a similar thing in their procurement. That sort of takes care of their taxpayer and their employees within their province, the ability to work in the province. But if you're not able to meet sort of that target budgeted idea, then it can go out to other companies. So there's ways to accomplish that. But you're quite right. There's never that conversation around the table about what about the taxpayer, and these are things and barriers that do need broken down and discussed as we're having these conversations.
Well, you did admit or recognize the question of Nova Scotia companies bidding on contracts and sometimes not being quite as competitive as a company from outside who simply might be competitive on that contract because they currently are perhaps without work, so they sharpen their pencil. And you came up with a plan where you said, okay, as long as the locals, the Nova Scotians, are within 10%, we'll accept it. But it gets worse when it gets smaller. I saw on the news recently about a little microbrewery in Ottawa that sells its own unique beer, and Nova Scotia is famous for many, many, many microbreweries around the province. And this poor guy in Ottawa could look across the river to Quebec and was not allowed to send his beer across the bridge. And that kind of thing. And when it gets to be small, it hurts people more deeply because it hurts somebody who's small. The big companies can always get through. They always have the ear of government. But again, I say the little guys don't. And that's what I'm thinking is these interprovincial barriers are really barriers to the smaller companies that have no voice.
No, exactly. And I mean, over the weekend, there was a lot of conversations each minister was having with their stakeholders, and small business is key to these conversations as well. And they have to be at the table. And I think our government has proven that. We've had an open ear with small business. They've had a horrible time since 2020. Let's be very honest. They haven't had a great time, and restaurants and things. And the small businesses that you say, Bill, like the breweries that can export, that want to export, but there's barriers holding some of those back. And we need to have these conversations. And quite frankly, I mean, it really started last year when we, if you recall, when the legislature was sitting last spring and last fall, the conversation about Nova Scotia wineries and the exports that they and rules that they were meeting. So these conversations have started for a bit, but because of what's going on south of the border, it's speeding up some of those conversations. And as I said, we have a lot of Canada looking at the Atlantic provinces and saying, "What are you doing? How did you achieve what you already have?"
Yeah, it's interesting that Trump lit the fire, and I hope it burns him at the appropriate place, frankly. But once lit, let's start talking about it internally. Let's use the light from that flame to cast light on the shadows in our own country.
No, exactly, Bill. It's taken up a lot of professional hours. It's taken up a lot of heartache in local businesses and employees that are curious what's going to happen over the next 30 days now, but what's going to happen over the next 4 years. There's a lot of heartache, and it's quite frankly, it doesn't need to be. But the sort of shining light, as you say, that there are some extra conversations that are happening that just unfortunately had to happen this way. But look, we will get through this, and we're, as the Premier has indicated to Nova Scotians, we're part of the Team Canada that are having these conversations now. And we will get through it, and I quite frankly think we're going to be a stronger Nova Scotia for it and a stronger Canada for it.
No, I think that's the longest we've ever talked about national affairs without touching on things in Cumberland South. So last couple of minutes, I know you always have something up your sleeve in your constituency. What's happening in the South, my brother?
Well, what's happening? It's been a wintry couple days, but turning back to the frigid air. But look, this week I'm headed to Halifax. I did things remotely here today. I'm headed to Halifax tomorrow and for Friday. Actually coming back on Friday for a little bit before I head back out on the trail for hockey this weekend. But a big supporter of myself and the previous MLA and Mayor Murray Scott, but Russell Fisher, a resident. I don't normally talk about the passing of anyone, but Russell Fisher was a big supporter of myself when I first said I was going to run for politics. Russell was actually a candidate in an election, I believe, late 70s, early 80s under the Buchanan government. He was a candidate in Cumberland Centre at the time. So Russell passed away last week, and I just want to give my thoughts to the family. I don't normally talk about the funerals, but Russell was a big supporter of me, so I just wanted to give a little bit of shout out to Russell and his family, and we're thinking of them today.
Well, it's just another example, I think, frankly, of how you present yourself a wee bit differently than most politicians. You give credit where credit's due, and including to the opposition at times, and you recognize people historically as well. So you're kind of down to earth, and I like that about you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Bill, and I'd be remiss. Another big community member in Parisboro we lost recently this week. Ed Gilbert was a big fixture at the Ottawa House on July 1st when we'd be down there. Historian always loved to tell his historic figures, but Ed was a big fixture in Parisboro, and everybody knew Ed, and Ed passed away this week. So my thoughts are with he and his family. My daughter, when we were first going to July 1st events at Ottawa House, Ed was a tall man, and my daughter would always refer to him as the friendly giant. But certainly, our thoughts are with Ed and his family, Ed's family today, as well as we're thinking about Parisboro and the community as well. He was a big figure in the Parisboro community. That's a hole that's never going to be filled, I don't think.
One last thought as you go away. If you're going to keep going to Treasury Board like you've been, and we have to keep moving your interview, why don't we simply move to 11 o'clock and leave it there?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to look at that, Bill, and I'll certainly get back to you on that. But 11 o'clock sounds like a better time than have to wait around and cancel, postpone. But I certainly appreciate the fact that we're always able to get on the air at some point throughout the week. I don't think we've missed a scheduled week yet, and I don't want to break that tradition.